the chairman of the occasion, Professor Bolaji Akinyemi, former Nigeria External Affairs Minister, the Director General of the NIIA, Professor Egosa Osagai, the Yeye Odua of Yoruba land, Erelu Abiola Dosomo, Professor Femi Otubanyo, ambassadors, distinguished guests, good afternoon, and let me say how pleased I am to be with all of you today. It is a great honor for me to come to this forum, to this institute, and speak to you all. One, because it is my first visit to Nigeria, and perhaps a public forum where we speak about our relationship is a good way to start that, but also because the NIIA has a long relationship with a similar institution in India with which I myself had a long association, the Indian Council of World Affairs. And I think 2 years ago, Professor Osagai, we had the privilege of welcoming you as a distinguished visitor. And today, my presence here, I hope, would help to contribute to the relationship between the two institutions. Now, as you were told, our relationship, that between India and Nigeria, predates the independence of Nigeria. Our diplomatic presence was set up in Lagos in 1958. And even before that, there were generations of Nigerians who had known Indian teachers, who had known Indian traders, who had a connect with India before there was a formal diplomatic one. But after independence, there were other methods and other facets of this connection. As we went about our nation building, our militaries collaborated. The National Defense Academy at Kaduna is a symbol of our army cooperation, just as the Naval War College at Port Harcourt is an example of our naval cooperation. And over the decades, we've actually had a lot of toing and froing, of meeting of minds. I discovered, have friends who have spent time here in various capacities. And in fact, in many ways, we hold up Nigeria as an example of our international technical and education cooperation program, because the alumni of that program have actually done the relationship very proud over many years. Now, as the world became more globalized, this relationship also acquired other dimensions, some building on the past, some reflecting the new. And one of them today is the presence of an Indian community of, I believe, about 60,000 people who are a living bridge between our two countries, who serve the relationship in multiple ways, and who ensure that while politics come and go, while economic changes happen, that link between our two societies remains strong and remains steady. Now, over the years, but others too, have helped build a very strong economic relationship. We, I believe, have today an investment commitment in this country of close to $30 billion. Our annual trade fluctuates between $12 to $15 billion. And quite rightfully, we have today a relationship that we characterize as a strategic partnership. Now, I say all this because as the first stop on a first visit I think it's important for me to recognize how far this relationship has come. But I'm here to talk about the global agenda and about the global south. So allow me to shift gears and address that topic. Interestingly, I'm coming here from a non-aligned meeting in Kampala. And I say this because the Honorable Professor and former Foreign Minister referred to the non-aligned connection between us, but also because today it is one reflection of both the global south and the global agenda. I'm also coming from a G20 presidency that India was proud to chair, where we saw the expansion and the first ever membership admission of the African Union on a permanent basis. And I'm very proud to say that this was an initiative that was personally led by my Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. We were very honored during the G20 to have the participation of Nigeria, not just in the G20, but also in the Voice of the Global South summits that both preceded and succeeded the main summit. Now, I refer to the non-aligned meeting, I speak of the G20, because in many ways they are examples, recent contemporary examples of the global conversation that is underway. And this global conversation is actually focusing on the advancement of the global south, because without the advancement of the global south, we are not going to see planetary progress. But this global conversation, by its very nature, is constantly distracted. Some crisis happens, some big event happens, some other agenda comes in place, and the global conversation then wobbles, it goes off track. People lose that sense of focus about what are the priorities. So one of the big achievements of our G20 presidency was that after some experience with a very polarized, divided world, which was very much, I would say, focused on one particular region, we were able to bring back the attention of the G20, we were able to bring back the attention of the world, we were able to bring back the attention of the global south on the issues that really count today. And those issues are those of sustainable development goals, of clean and green growth, of women-led development, of health, energy and food security, of digital public infrastructure, of indeed of our way of life and of our planet's future, and of the fact that the growth of the majority of this planet should not be traded against arguments of the well-being of the planet. Both are possible if only we fashion our policies correctly. Now, as I said today, one part of the debate is what is actually the global agenda. I gave you some examples. And these examples actually point us in a certain direction. They point us in the direction, obviously, of progress, where every society, in a manner in which it is itself comfortable, is able to advance, where prosperity is not the privilege of a few, where growth is robust, is sustainable, is green, where there is security, where there is stability, and where, as I said, the basic needs of food, of health, of energy are met, where climate action advances along with climate justice, and where the focus of the world, as it rightfully should be, must remain on Agenda 2030. And I can tell you that for me, perhaps really an objective assessment of our own G20 presidency was when I went at the end of September to New York and I heard from the Secretary General of the United Nations his appreciation that once again the conversation was on the right issues, that the SDG summit, the summit of the future that will happen later this year, these will be taking up what concerns the majority of the people of this planet. And it concerns them because whether we speak about our domestic policies at home or whether today we debate international relations abroad, the simple principle that must guide global governance, global conversations, global debates is a conviction that no one should be left behind. And when we speak about no one being left behind, I think the welfare of Africa is particularly important. In fact, I would say the rise of Africa is even more crucial because in a changing global order, we have seen growth in continents once they got decolonized. That growth over a period of time created a rebalancing, a political rebalancing and economic rebalancing. And that rebalancing today is creating a world of multipolar, of a multipolar nature, where, as His Excellency said, middle powers and perhaps others too, regional organizations, would have a fairer and more equitable say in how the world is run. So the global agenda, in many ways, today is about restoring the world to its natural diversity. Because the world was diverse, the world is diverse, it was distorted by the period of Western domination. And in a post-colonial world today, restoring that natural diversity is actually our collective objective. Now, what are the challenges to that process? One, of course, is while many of us attained independence, we have all built our nations and societies. The reality is also that the old domination has not let go. That in different ways, it may not be the imperialism of the 19th and early 20th century, but in different ways, today, many of those who dominated the world for the last 200 to 300 years continue to do so with new instruments, with new regimes, with different techniques. And how do we contest that? How do we overcome that? How do we make sure the world is a fairer place? That is challenge number one. Challenge number two is of a more recent vintage. We have, for the last 3 decades, spoken about globalization. Globalization has been a game changer. Some people argue that there was always globalization. People always moved from one place to another. That is correct. After all, people moved from Africa to other parts of the world. That's how the globe became the globe. But globalization today has a very specific sense. It is a combination of economics, of interdependence, of interpenetration, of a shared common dependence on technology, of a degree of mobility that we have never experienced before. Now, while globalization has had many positive results, it has also undeniably led to very deep economic concentrations. That much of the world today depends on production of a few geographies. Now, it worked when we believed that the entire world could be run in the manner in which Japanese cars are produced in Nagoya, that everything came just in time to meet the requirements of the day. We were wrong, but we didn't know it. And then COVID came. And COVID brought home to every one of us that the most basic things of our life, we were often dependent on suppliers and producers from far away. Not just dependent on them, as we discovered during COVID, we were hostage to them. That many of us struggled with masks and gloves and PPEs and ventilators and basic medicines and vaccines. We struggled for food. So one of the big takeaways from the COVID experience is our world today needs to be de-risked from the over-concentration. That if we speak about a more balanced world, a more democratic world, democratic is not just political democratic. It is not just the rights of different nations. Democratic also means every region, sometimes every large country, must have within its own grasp the basics of its production so that it is economically and socially secure. This is our challenge number 2. Challenge number 3, of course, is the setting of narratives. And I spoke about the old domination. The old domination today doesn't tell you what to do with a stick. The old domination will tell you what to do through social media, through regular media, through devising what is politically correct, to setting standards. And this narrative setting is actually a very powerful force today in international relations. There are thinking, there are ideologies, there are regimes which are raised up, brought down, made irrelevant, brought to the center through narrative setting. In all of this, of course, we have the challenges of the polarization of the world. We in India know it particularly strongly and recently because we struggled with it during our G20 presidency. That a conflict such as one taking place in Ukraine has polarized the East and the West. That developmental issues have polarized the North and the South. So how do we today talk of a global agenda when the globe itself is so divided? That is a challenge in itself. There are, of course, the traditional what are called global issues. These are challenges which threaten every nation but are bigger than what could be contained within the borders. So it could be terrorism, a challenge which I know Nigeria has had to experience in its own way, like we have had to in a different way, or maritime security, piracy, challenges, of course, of climate events that we are seeing more and more frequently. So these are some of the challenges that we have to overcome if we have to really get along with the global agenda. Some, as I said, are traditional, some have evolved, some are more recent. When I spoke about globalization and concentration, a different challenge emerging out of that is how globalization itself has been weaponized. That today currency is a weapon, trade is a weapon, tourism is a weapon. That dominant players, they may be dominant as producers, they may be dominant as consumers, that they often with very little hesitation leverage their market shares on the global system for their particular national purpose. And of course, underlying all of this, since this is an institute dealing with international affairs, is a challenge that we know very, very well, which is a world order that was devised in 1945, when the members of the United Nations were roughly 25% of what they are today. And that world order continues obstinately because those who are in the driving seat don't want to create more seats for other people to be at that engine. So these are really the global agenda challenges which in different ways are obstacles for achieving what we actually all implicitly or explicitly have arrived at as our objectives. Now, in this topic and even otherwise, I think you would all be conscious that we have started using the word global south more frequently. More frequently, more loudly, I would say more effectively. And you know you are effective when there is an industry questioning that there is a global south, that people write columns saying, what is this term global south? It doesn't make any sense. Why are they doing it? So when people start protesting at what you're doing, you know it's working. So what is the global south? Because all of us are asked that question, particularly from people who are not the global south. Because remember, if you are from the global south, you have no problem understanding it. It's intuitive. So I would say global south, most of all, is a mindset. Those who have it, have it. Those who don't have it will never get it. But it is a mindset which has some core principles. These are principles from our habits, from our political culture, from the way we have practiced international relations over the last 60, 70, 80 years. For example, non-intervention. For example, non-interference, or being non-judgmental, or non-alliance. But I have given you 4 nons, so let me give you a positive definition. Global South is finally about solidarity. Global South means having a heart. Global South means willing to share. So when people say, okay, tell me, how does this Global South work? I give them an example from our own experience. I tell people, look, in my country, we were still vaccinating people when we started supplying vaccines to 100 countries in the world. And I compare it to global north, where there were countries sitting on vaccines 8 times the number of their population, and they wouldn't give it to a small island next to them. That is the difference to me between global south and global north. So, how does the global south today deal with the global north, or with the global agenda? I think in many ways, by obviously being empathetic, by understanding the problems, by being respectful, by recognizing that every country has its sovereignty, every country has its culture, every country has its tradition, and solutions must be found in a way in which they are not imposed, that they are organically owned by the society which is actually going to be implementing that solution. And I would also say today that an important part of that is beyond politics, beyond economics, beyond technology, to also remember who we are and to factor in culture, traditions, heritage, because these are part of our DNA. We all are more comfortable with certain solutions and certain methods because that is part of our culture. So I would define global south and the manner in which the global south works as a mix of all of this, of political consideration, of economic sharing, of technology spread, but of cultural sensitivity. So in all of this, because the title was Global Agenda, India and the Global South. So what can India do? What can India do with the Global South? In a sense, for the Global South. And in a way, I answered the observation which Professor Akinyemi made, which was, he said, the more the world changes, the more it remains the same. Maybe. But let me tell you what has changed in India. In fact, he himself gave us an example, the lunar landing. I give you another. The fact that we could produce vaccines on such a massive scale, not just for our needs, but for the world at large. Not just produce vaccines, invent vaccines. Or if one looks today at technology, the fact that there is a 5G stack in telecom, there's an India stack when it comes to digital infrastructure. The fact that on a matter today as important but as basic as food security, we are actually rediscovering our traditions in propagating millets, because millets is very much part of our tradition and one which all of us have unfortunately diluted, both to our own cost and to that of the planet. So the question, what has changed? I would say in all objectivity today, India can and is contributing more. India is in many ways a demonstrator or a laboratory or an application of change, of progress. And because the capacities have grown, the capabilities have grown, but the willingness has always been there. Today, our ability to share has increased. So let me share, speak to you about some very practical way, because one part of it is to say, yes, we are Global South, we should be sharing, we should be doing good, we should be helping each other. Okay, nice words. What does it mean in reality? I'll give you 7 or 8 examples. One, I would say, where India can really make a difference in respect of Global South is on digital public infrastructure. That the biggest change which has happened in India in the last decade, and believe me, you have to come to India to see what I would describe as a veritable revolution, is the fact that we have created a digital backbone, and on that digital backbone today there are delivery of programs and benefits to citizens on a scale, efficiency and honesty which could not have been imagined earlier. Where actually 2/3 of the population can get food without it being pilfered, where loans are given to 1/3 of the population without somebody taking a cut, where those who are really in need of health support can demonstrate their eligibility and get free or subsidized health services, where today 200 million people have actually, in the last decade, since 2014, 200 million people have got new homes. So the scale of what has happened in terms, once you leverage the digital system as a governance system, is something which we believe can be a very, very important contribution to the Global South, and one obviously in which we are willing to be a technology partner and supporter. I spoke about vaccines, but health issues did not go away once COVID receded. And if you look around the world, one of the biggest challenges which countries face is the cost of the health system. These are not just developing countries. Developed countries have a huge problem with the health system. Many of them can't afford, their citizens are outside the health system because of the cost. today again, we have tried to create nationally for 1.4 billion people a system of low-cost medicines which is primarily based on generics, where through bulk purchases, through making it accessible on a large scale, we are able to dramatically reduce the cost. These are called people's pharmacy, and this is really, I would say, this is not rocket science. It is a good example of political will, inventory management, and a feeling for those who are vulnerable, who could not afford medicines otherwise. We spoke about space. The lunar landing was one demonstration. But again, space is a domain which holds so much possibilities for development, that from space, and it could be space, but again I talk of a much lower orbit technology, drones. That application of space assets, use of drones today have again tremendous implications for our daily life. Or indeed, the support which we give to each other. India today has executed 600 projects in 78 countries across the world as part of that global South solidarity. So I mention all this because it's one thing to speak about solidarity, to refer to cooperation, and we are all genuine in that expression of sentiment. But what has changed is today the ability to translate that sentiment into practical activity, into assets, into solutions, that in a large part of the global South, certainly I would say from the east coast of Africa probably till the west coast of Australia, we are today a first responder. If something happens, more likely than not you will see Indian forces out there among the first to go in. So to me, global South is actually a movement whose spirit, whose sentiment, whose commitment needs to be harnessed for the betterment of the world in very, very practical ways. And I certainly hope that in this manner, through existing bodies, through mechanisms like G20, through a process like the Voice of the Global South Summit, through South-South cooperation, through bilateral relationships, that we can find ways by which we share experiences, where we reinforce each other, where in many ways we actually complement our capabilities. It is in pursuit of those objectives that I am here. I will be going on tomorrow to Abuja to discuss with my counterpart how to take these practical things forward through a joint commission. But I am really very appreciative today that you have given me an opportunity to share these sentiments with all of you. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you all for your questions and for the interests that underpin those questions. So let me begin with the observation or the question. Really, India was in great difficulties in 1991, about 32 years ago. Today we are in a different place. Are there lessons there? And if so, what are they? In a way, because there's some similarity between your question and what the gentleman there asked, which is every country has to find to some degree its own solution. But every country to some degree also finds part of a common solution. I mean, that's the way it is, which is why we study each other, which is why we relate to each other, which is why we discuss with each other. I think what has happened in India's case is it's not also that our path was always linear, predictable. We've had our ups and downs. But what has certainly changed, I would say, particularly in the last 10 years, and I say this as someone who's been now close to almost nearing my 50 years in government, that in the last 10 years, in a sense, there's a certain leadership, there's a vision, there's a deployment of technology, there's an understanding of technology. There is a kind of a energy in the society which has been awoken and given channels to express itself. People were always smart, but if you give people, say smart people, a sense of a startup culture, the same smart minds which would have otherwise not perhaps produced startup businesses and 100 unicorns that we have today would have frittered itself away. So it's very hard to say what are the exact combination of factors which accelerate national growth and progress, or which slow it down, or which plateau it. It's a variety of these. But in fact, even the idea of what itself is progress has changed. That if one looks simply at growth rates, we had great growth rates in previous decades, but the growth rates did not translate into benefits for many sections of the society. So there were parts of the country which were racing ahead, and there were parts of the country for whom not that much had changed. So building an inclusive society doesn't have to be a bleeding heart exercise. It's actually common sense, because if you look in terms of predictable demand in a society, consumption in a society, so it is both the smart thing and the noble thing, the right thing to do. So I would say, there are aspects of our growth and development and experiences which will have relevance. We approach the world, especially countries of the global south, with that viewpoint. But at the end of the day, they have to absorb it and devise their own answer. Now, the second question, if there is momentum, how do you insulate it from politics, from global politics? It's a tough job. I just look at the last 2 years, or I'd say last 5 years. Before us, Indonesia was the chair of the G20. Okay. Despite Indonesia's best efforts, their G20 presidency was completely and utterly dominated by the Ukraine issue, and a whole lot of other development issues, SDG, climate, reform of international financial institutions, gender issue, food issues, they got sidelined. So this can happen, and I think it's again part of why we need a strong global south solidarity, is to make sure today that the world is discussing what is the real agenda for the majority of its inhabitants, that its agenda is not skewed by the interests or the concerns of a few, however legitimate those interests may be. On the issue, Madam, about how do you counteract new colonialism, it is so pervasive. It's visible in so many ways, even in our daily life. It's in the newspapers we read, it's in the TV we see, it's in the football matches we watch. It is, even if something unfortunate occurs, we would all like to believe that human life is the same everywhere. But the reality is, enormous tragedies pass uncommented, which is not disrespecting, the misfortunes of others. But the bottom line is the world is still far, far away from being a fair, just and equitable planet. And after 250 years of a certain domination, it will take generations. There was a belief initially, once we got independence, now everything will be all right. Okay. Now we are struggling for economic strength. Most of us believe if you are economically stronger, everything will be all right. But I tell you, it will not be, because there will be cultural issues. There will be norms, there will be standards. So how do we actually get something which is more mutually respectful? Not just as a diplomatic gesture, but as a societal behavior. This, I think, is a very hard challenge that awaits us, and I think this is one of the things that the Global South should collectively strive for. The paradigms of development, I go back to the gentleman on the left. It's not a question of any country offering lessons to another, but I would make one point. Again, I'm speaking from our own experience, understandably. One of the big changes which has happened in my country in the last decade are very basic changes. One is connecting houses to piped water. It's a very basic change, but it's a very big change. That a decade ago, a very large part of our population used to go and get the water from the nearest collection pool that they had. Now, once you give them piped water, or once you give them electricity, it's not just a comfort of life, you're actually changing society. So to me, basic things, our Prime Minister likes to say, a lot of it is about technology, a lot of it is about tradition. Now, basic things are as important as the biggest tech. In fact, one can be used to deploy the other. And the last point, the rise of Africa. Look, I know, there are some particularly daunting challenges which different countries are facing. My point is this: the world will not be multipolar, the world will not be truly diverse, the world will not have a true sense of participation and ownership if 54 countries of the world are left out of the manner in which the world is discussed and run. And for us, when we became independent, there was a widespread feeling that India's independence was not complete till Africa got its independence. Today, I would say our growth and prosperity will also not complete until we see that Africa too has got what is rightfully theirs.